On the second half of today's lesson, we are going to end up having to write an equation given a chart. And also we need to figure out what's our x values, what are our y values, what are the inputs, what are the outputs. So let's take a look at these two scenarios. First one is that we have the temperature of water when it begins to boil is a function of altitude. Well, that tells us something about what is x and what is y. If we look at it, this word is represents an equals sign. And so if we write down temperature, the temperature equals, and it is a function of altitude. So that means that we're going to end up having altitude being manipulated and then equaling temperature. So that means that we're going to have some sort of constant that is going to end up changing this altitude. And so that tells me that my temperature depends on altitude. Altitude is my independent event. Temperature depends on it. And so when I have this kind of looks like this form. Y equals my slope, my constant rate of change, times by my x value. And then typically we'll have some sort of constant being added to this x term as well. So that tells me that temperature is y and altitude is my x value. And the key is that we have the y value is typically the independent or the dependent variable. It's dependent on the altitude. Altitude is my independent variable. So the independent variable is going to end up being your x value. The dependent variable will be the y value. So from there, what we can do is, once we know what is x and what is y, now we can find the slope of the line. So remember, the slope is when we take our y values. Now, we have more y values than we need. We only need 2. So let's just go ahead and cross off one of these points, and we'll just take a look at these two values here. So this is an ordered pair, 1,000, 210. So I'm going to put 210 up top, minus 209. Now, since I started with 210, I've got to start with 1,000. So I'm going to take these x values and put them on the bottom. So I'll start with 1,000, and I'll take away 1,500. So I go ahead and do that work. I've got 1 over, and then this makes negative 500. So 1 over negative 500 is the same as negative 1 over 500. And you could even write it with the negative sign right in between the two numbers, right in line with that fraction bar. And it all means the same thing. So now I've got my slope. I can take the slope in one of the points, doesn't matter which one, and we can put it into that point slope formula. So remember, it goes this way, y minus y1. Well, I'll use this point right here. My y value is 210. So I'll put 210 right next to the y. So y minus 210 equals the slope, negative 1 over 500, multiplied by x minus the x value, 1,000. And again, you could have used either of these other 2 points. I just chose to use the first one. So from that point, we use the distributive property. We distribute the negative 1 over 500 over that subtraction. And so what's left over? Well, let's write it down. We've got y minus 210 equals a negative 1 over 500 x, and then this part here is positive because the two negatives make a positive, and it's going to be positive 2. Now let's see how I got that. Negative 1 over 500 times by negative 1,000 over 1. If you see a number, you can always write it over 1. Well, you see there's some cross-canceling that's going to end up occurring here. These two zeros get canceled out. We'll cancel out those two zeros. And then 5 goes into 10 just 2 times. So the two negatives make a positive, and that's why we have positive 2. Well, just one more step here. Got to move this 210 over, so I'll go ahead and add 210 to both sides. And when I do that, we've got our answer. So we can just write that in the slope-intercept form. And so it's y equals negative 1 over 500 x, and then plus 212. So there's my equation. So now what we want to do is we want to answer that next question, which says, find the temperature when water boils at 6,000 feet. Well, what's the feet represents altitude. Altitudes are independent variable. So it doesn't matter what number of feet we pick. We can pick any number here, but the temperature at that elevation is dependent on that elevation. So we're going to go ahead and substitute this 6,000 in for x. So it's negative 1 over 500 times by, and then this is what we're substituting. We put in that 6,000. I'll write that as a fraction, 6,000 over 1, plus 212. So we go ahead and do that cross-canceling. We can cross out these two zeros. We'll cross out these two zeros. So it's really just 5 into 60, which goes 12 times. So go ahead and multiply what's left over there. Negative 1 times by the 12 leaves me with negative 12. Plus 212, well, that makes 200. So there it is. The value, or water is going to end up boiling only at 200 degrees Fahrenheit at 6,000 feet. That's why you see on recipes when they have altitude at a certain amount, they tell you to boil it for longer, because it takes longer for it to get up to that temperature. At least it boils quicker, it just takes longer to get up to that temperature after it's boiling. Well, let's take a look at the next problem. Here's another example similar to what you saw in this last one. And let's look at what it says here. The cost of an ad is a function. There's that word again. Is means equals. So the cost equals is a function of the number of lines. So function of the number of lines. That means you're going to end up having to do some multiplication of something times by the number of lines. And so that tells us right away that lines is our dependent or independent variable. So it doesn't matter how many lines I end up picking. I'm going to take my independent variable and multiply it by some sort of constant rate of change, which is our slope, and it's going to equal our dependent variable. So cost depends on lines. So that tells me that lines represents our x value, cost is our y value. So with that said, now we can figure out what our slope is. So our slope is equal to, and then we put in our y values up top. So I'll do 17.25 minus, and then we can go with, how about this 28.5, and then we'll do, since I start with 17.25, I've got to start with the 5 minus 10. So I go ahead and do that work there, and I subtract that 17.25 minus that 28.5. If you check that work out, I end up with a negative 11.25. And this is all over negative 5. And so I go ahead and do that work, and the negative signs will cancel, and if I do the division, divide by 5, I end up with a decimal, 2.25. Now typically we don't write decimals and fractions, but that's pretty much what it is. 2.25 in the y direction, one space over in the x direction. So remember what this represents. This represents cost 2, and then we have lines. So basically, one line costs $2.25. So there it is. So that's what we have. But we have to figure out our equation next. So we're going to end up taking one of the points, doesn't matter which one you take, and you're going to end up using the slope and that point into the point slope formula. So I'm going to go ahead and use this point right now. So I haven't used this point yet, so I might as well use it. So I'll write down y minus 1275. And then this equals, the slope, which is 2.25, times by, and then x minus 3. So we'll go ahead and do some multiplication there. Use that distributive property. Multiply the 225 over that subtraction, and here's what's left over. Still have this y minus 1275 equals, and then I go ahead and multiply this. I get 225x minus, and then I multiply 2.25 times by 3 gives me 6.75. So I just have one more step there. I need to do some opposite operations. So I'll go ahead and isolate the y by adding the 12.75 to both sides. So I'll add that 12.75, and when I do that, you see the bigger number I should put on top when I do the subtraction, but the 75 cents cancels out, and I have to subtract those two numbers because they're opposite in sign, and I end up with 6. So what this equation is telling me is the y, which represents the cost, equals $2.25 per line, so times by the number of lines, plus $6. So you start off with a $6 charge, no matter how many lines you're going to have for this newspaper, and then you're going to pay $2.25 per line. So that's part of the problem. They wanted us to write an equation to match that information, but then we have to go ahead and follow what it says here. Well, find the cost of 21 lines. 21 needs to get multiplied by, well, lines represents the x value, so we put that in place of x. So I'll rewrite this as y equals 2.25 times by 21 lines plus the $6 that we're going to be charged. So we do that 2.25 times by 21. That gives me $47.25. That's how newspapers make their money, selling that advertisement. Well, all we have to do from there is add that $6 on, which is our constant, our starting amount. That means the value that you're going to be charged is $53.25. So there it is. So those are some examples of word problems that we have to write into an equation. The key is to look for what is x and what's y. And remember that x is always going to be the independent event. Y is the dependent event. So you got to think about what depends on what. Temperature is dependent on altitude. The temperature of water boiling depends on how high up we are. And just as the cost of running an ad depends on how many lines we decide to end up using. One line is going to be cheaper than 21 lines. So thinking about what is x and what is y is important so that you know how to figure out what the slope of the line is. Well, good luck on tonight's problems.